Welcome to the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Today, we are going to talk all about strength training and range of motion. And in order to have this conversation, we thought that we would bring on, we invited on a very special guest, one Greg Nuckols. So Greg has his master's degree in exercise and sport science. He has held or holds, and maybe he can correct me there, 3 all-time world records in powerlifting. He is the co-founder of Stronger by Science. He is one of the founders of MASS, which is a research review for strength sports. And he is also the author of multiple books, such as The Art and Science of Lifting. He is also the co-creator of MacroFactor, a nutrition app, as well as an international speaker, gourmet chef, and dog owner to Oswald. So, Greg, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me on. And I got to say, you're making me sound much cooler than I really am. And to be clear, I did formerly hold records in powerlifting. People have gotten a lot stronger than they were back when I was competing, but back in my day, I was really something.
My claim to swimming fame is similar. So I held a couple of All-American records.
Nice.
And they were broken in the last couple of years. I didn't find out until like 2 years later, which is better for my ego.
Nice.
Because I thought I just walked around as if I was an American record holder for a couple of years when I wasn't. So I can appreciate that.
Very cool. Well, I definitely don't think that Travis talked to you, exaggerated how cool you are. Just for the record, we are super thankful to have you here today, Greg. And another interesting thing about our setting today is that we are here not where we usually record, Travis, but we just so happen to be lucky enough to record this episode in, I guess, what we would call Stronger by Science headquarters. So we're not in a normal spot, but we are in the official podcast recording room of where Greg runs his business. And so it's super cool to be here. And Greg has actually been an inspiration and someone that both Travis and I have admired for a long time. I've been a subscribing member of MASS, that research review that Travis mentioned in the intro, which it's just such a great way to learn about the science of strength training, which is something that I love to do, but then as a yogi, kind of integrating it into yoga and kind of bringing those insights in. But I've just learned a ton from you guys and your work.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And the link to MASS will be in the show notes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we'll link to that offering. But the main reason, as Travis mentioned in the beginning, the main reason that we invited Greg on today was to chat about strength training and range of motion. Or we might say strength training and flexibility. And the reason that that's interesting and pertinent for our yoga audience is that yoga and flexibility are kind of intimately connected, as we all know. And yoga is about a lot more than just stretching. I think sometimes there's this idea that all we do in yoga is stretch, and there's a ton more than that. But flexibility is certainly a key component of a yoga practice. And if to the extent that there could be a connection between flexibility and strength training, I think yogis might want to know about that. And what they might do outside of their practice or even within their practice. So
should we also mention Greg's tie to the yoga world?
100%. Thank you for bringing that up, Travis. Yes, Greg is not just in the strength world. He actually has a yoga connection. Do you want to tell us about that?
I think calling it a connection is overstating it. But to potentially overstate it further, what I tell people, mostly as a joke, is that I have taught yoga at the graduate level. And by that I mean when I was in my master's program, part of that, for our stipend and tuition remittance, is we basically had to teach PE classes for the undergrad students, and we had minimal say over what classes we taught. And so I was assigned to a yoga class 1 year, and just muddled through it the best I could. I did actually used to do yoga with some regularity. Right. When I was in high school, I had a pretty bad back injury, and I had heard that yoga was good for that. And so my senior year, I didn't have a first period, like I didn't have a morning class. And so I would just go to the morning yoga class at the local YMCA. And so
Amazing.
it was me and just a room of women who I don't think there was a single other person in that room under about 75 years old. And I'm a 17-year-old boy, and I'm like, you know what, this is fun. They were so much better at yoga than I was.
I was just gonna say, I bet they were all a lot more
tremendously
adapted to the practice,
absolutely,
especially when you started.
Absolutely. So it was equal parts fun and humbling.
Right. I love that description. And I love that you have that experience. And it just, when you first told me that you had taught yoga, because, I've tuned into you and all of your strength and research offerings in this whole other world. I was like blown away when you told me that you had been a yoga teacher. I mean, officially you could say that.
I mean, theoretically.
Right.
Yeah.
But still, it's just a very cool connection. So yeah.
I don't think I was a good yoga teacher. I just want to make that clear.
Actually, I thought that the students liked you.
I got good teacher reviews, but I think that may be somewhat disconnected from the actual quality of my yoga instruction.
That's part of it, though, right?
Sure, yeah.
Like, as a yoga teacher, you would want the students to like you.
Right.
Like, it's tied into the quality of the practice. Or they're so intertwined.
I would think so. Like that interconnection or that relationship.
Anyway, it was fun regardless.
I'm so glad. And now you can say.
And you can add it to your long resume.
Yeah, sure. That works.
Taught yoga at the graduate level. It's so funny. Because
the other two of us in the room who have potentially a stronger tie to yoga have not taught yoga at the graduate level.
That's like you and I have not taught yoga. Oh my gosh. So anyway, yes. So our listeners and our audience can definitely see that there is a connection there. And what gave us the idea, Greg, to invite you on today? So I think our vision is we love to talk kind of in general about the connection between strength training and flexibility, range of motion. Mm-hmm. But there was a specific reason that we thought of you. And that was because a few months ago in an issue of Mass, because it's like this monthly review that comes out, a few months ago, there was a research brief, I think it was called, that you wrote, Greg, that was about a specific study that had to do with powerlifting, which that's a type of lifting weights for our audience who might not know. And it was the connection between powerlifting and I guess technically the title of the study was Powerlifting and Performance. But in the study, they measured range of motion and there were these connections between how their level of performance, or maybe we could say how strong they were, and their measurements of range of motion at certain joints. And I thought the study was super interesting, but what I thought was more interesting was your review and interpretation of it. And when I read that, I was like, that's something we have to, our listeners are going to love this. We have to talk about it on the podcast. And then I just thought, is there any way that maybe Greg himself could just talk about his own interpretation? So those ideas, maybe we could talk about that study, what you had to say about it. And I'm sure that'll launch us into maybe some bigger questions around the connection between strength training and range of motion.
I'm actually really glad you gave that lead in, because when you told me that we were talking about resistance training and range of motion, I thought you were going to want to talk about another study that I had previously written about.
Correct.
So that's kind of what I looked over. So that's good. No,
the Afonso one.
Yeah. So this gave me time to look up the Spence study that I think you're referring to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm locked and loaded and ready to go either way.
I think Travis and I thought we might talk.
I think they're intertwined. Well, yeah. We both in particular, I think, are topics of interest for today. But I guess the motivating factor in particular was the Spence one.
Cool. Right.
Yeah,
but it definitely draws to the bigger picture of the Afonso one.
That works.
Because I think part of the reason that, and we're going to talk about it, but part of the reason the Spence one is extra interesting is in comparison to the Afonso study, and because I think it's helped influence us to think one thing about the connection between strength training and range of motion, and then the Spence study potentially through maybe a question in that direction. Like we might be like, what? These don't compute. But that's why I think kind of bringing it all together in your interpretation.
Cool. Yeah, that works.
So maybe before diving into the Spence study specifically, maybe Greg could tell us about the one that came before the Afonso systematic review and meta. I mean, I just realized maybe studying that as a foundation.
Yeah, for sure. So this was published last year, I believe. The title, for anyone who wants to look it up, I'm sure you'll link it in the show notes,
Right.
was Strength Training versus Stretching for Improving Range of Motion, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And so this was, I think that this pretty comprehensively, at least I hope, debunks a lot of the fears that I think some people still have that resistance training will make you stiff or tight or necessarily reduce your range of motion. Because that was a notion that a lot of people had, and like even independent of yoga, resistance training took a lot longer to catch on in a lot of sports than it probably should have, because a lot of sports coaches and also strength and conditioning coaches had this idea that lifting weights would make you tight and make you slow. And so, for a sport like football, where being stronger would help you, being faster also helps you. And they thought, oh man, if people lift, they're going to get too tight, they're going to take shorter strides, they'll get slower, and that's going to negatively impact performance. And I think that at least in like the S&C world, there's not as much of a concern about that anymore. But I do still think that there are some general lingering concerns about that. And so what this meta-analysis did is it essentially just like looked at studies where one group did stretching, one group did resistance training. I think there were also sub-analyses where it was just like only looking at studies where resistance training occurred and only looking at studies where stretching occurred, and just kind of like comparing effect estimates. But regardless, in general, what it found is not only does resistance training not reduce range of motion, it actually seems to improve range of motion to a degree that is comparable to stretching interventions.
Right.
And I think there are a few bits of nuance to put behind that. So one is the vast majority of the studies in that meta-analysis were just looking at hamstrings flexibility. So, that's actually like an important note for just like a lot of resistance training research. So like with hypertrophy research, for example, there are a lot of things where we say like, oh, like this particular mix of variables or this particular intervention is really good for muscle hypertrophy. And you just kind of generalize that to the entire body. But then when you look into the individual studies, most of the time, I mean, for probably over half of the studies in our field, they just look at quad growth. And so like, it's not a completely unjustifiable assumption to assume that, yeah, whatever grows your quads will probably grow your shoulders and grow your lats as well. But, functionally, like most stuff is just looking at quad growth, some biceps, some triceps, but just a whole lot of studies looking at quad hypertrophy. And so it's a similar principle here where, I do think we can probably conclude that resistance training is generally beneficial for stretching or for improving range of motion to a degree that's comparable to stretching. But the only thing we know for sure about it is that it definitely works really well for improving hamstrings range of motion. And so, like knee extension range of motion, hip flexion range of motion. And I assume that's generalizable, but just being as rigorous as possible. Most of the studies in that meta were testing the hamstring specifically. So that's one thing to note. The other thing to note is that in most resistance training studies, people are either untrained or not like trained to an elite level for whatever outcome you're interested in measuring. And so like in the resistance training world, we often think about that in terms of how trained people are at resistance training. But for this particular meta, the thing to consider is how trained are these people for stretching? Because these aren't studies on high-level yogis or like professional ballet dancers or martial artists, gymnasts. Yeah, people who probably do already have exceptional flexibility. So, it basically shows that when you take people who haven't done much, if any, prior flexibility training, resistance training does improve range of motion. So we can't necessarily conclude that you can achieve elite world-class levels of range of motion just via resistance training. But we do know that, it can at least start putting you down that road, and it doesn't seem to reduce range of motion.
Yeah, I think that's super important if our audience is yogis, right? Yogis might be more flexible, or likely are more flexible than the average bear in some of these studies. And you have to be cautious in extrapolating the results. You have to realize that those studies are done on untrained people. And so we just don't have a meta-analysis of yogis, multiple studies that we've synthesized showing studying yogis and comparing the effects of strength training and stretching.
Yeah, so this is, I'll admit that this is definitely an extrapolation, but if resistance training does increase range of motion in people who are untrained for flexibility-related pursuits, I don't think it would be a safe assumption to think that it would reduce range of motion for people who already have great range of motion. It's theoretically possible, that's not kind of in the problem domain that's addressed with those studies, but it seems pretty unlikely to me.
So it seems like you would suggest, because I know Travis and I, we spend a lot of time talking to yogis about strength and about how yoga can build strength, but only up to a point. And if we're truly interested in real strength, that maybe we need to be doing something else, or maybe bring in a strength practice, something like that. But we do tend to see, and I think this is just societal anyway, but it definitely comes up in the yoga world, that there's sometimes this worry that in yoga, flexibility is really important in order for me to embody these poses, and I'm afraid that if I strength train, my muscles will get, quote, tight. And so we know that's a common myth.
Well, so I don't think it's completely a myth.
Right, yeah, a common belief, I guess I should say.
So two things to note about where a belief like that might come from and situations where it might be justified. And one of these, Travis will probably be able to explain better than I can. But so there's a temporal component to any sort of adaptation to training.
Temporal meaning time?
Yeah. So, something will happen immediately after training and very soon after training, and then maybe a very different set of things will happen over time. So, for example, if you're interested in resistance training and you're like, hey, I'm going to do some bench press because I want a stronger bench press. You go to the gym, you do a hard bench press workout, you come in the next day and you try bench pressing it again, and what do you know? You're weaker. You can't lift as much anymore. You don't then conclude bench press training doesn't make me stronger at bench press. It's just my bench press is lower 24 hours after a training session, but over the span of 3-6 months, a year, my bench press should go up. And so it's a very similar thing with flexibility and range of motion. So one of the things you might actually try to measure and assess to ascertain whether someone is recovered from a training session is whether their range of motion has gone back to baseline yet. So going back to bench press, if your pecs are really tight and in general, you're able to almost put your arms straight out to the side and go all the way back to where you can touch your hands behind your back. You just have truly incredible, shoulder horizontal extension range of motion. That will be reduced to some extent if your pecs are damaged and sore and inflamed from a training session. Same thing with the hamstrings. You do a hard hamstring training session, and then if you try to bend over and touch your toes, your hamstrings will be kind of guarding against that. You won't, it'll be harder to access the hip flexion range of motion, the knee extension range of motion that you typically would. And so it wouldn't surprise me if people who are very flexible and have never done resistance training try doing some resistance training and they're like, oh shit, 1 day, 2 day, maybe even 3 or 4 days after the session, I'm not as flexible as I used to be. I'm going down a bad road here. Whereas if you continue that over several months, it will potentially improve range of motion. And certainly just as you fully recover from that resistance training session, your flexibility would go back to normal. But certainly acutely, you do experience reductions in flexibility. And so if flexibility is something that really matters to you, I think it might be easy to just observe how range of motion changes and just generally how extensible your muscles feel and just kind of assume you're heading down a bad road. But it's just, a difference between short-term and long-term adaptations.
I could see that being really scary for a yogi, and potentially like they do it a couple times and they're like, I'm not doing that again.
Yeah.
Look what happened to my forward fold.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I've heard that exact comment from people before. We'll say, because they know that we're so about strength, and sometimes they write with questions. And I've had multiple times yogis will write and just say, I really do. I understand strength is important. But when I try strengthening, I just feel tight after. And then I do yoga the next day and I can't get as like deep. And I think that I'm so glad you brought up that distinction between short-term or long-term, or acute and chronic.
Yeah.
Because I think it's often the case that maybe we don't realize that there are these distinctions, and that the way the body responds in the short term might be different from long term. And we know, just like you said, you're weaker after a strength training session, you like acutely, but it doesn't mean that strength training makes us weak. And so it's like more about like this bigger picture, like stick with it over time and in the longer term, bigger picture than the positive change that you're looking for.
Yeah, so that same principle applies to flexibility and range of motion. The other thing, and like I said, Travis, as a biomechanist, I'm sure you can explain this better than me, but another adaptation to resistance training is it does increase muscular stiffness, which is kind of the scientific definition of that term, I think, is a little bit different from kind of the lay understanding of that term. When people hear muscular stiffness, they think, oh, like the muscle won't extend, I can't access a long range of motion anymore. Whereas muscular stiffness is just kind of a resistance to deformation. So, like let's say there's someone who can do a full forward fold, head all the way between their knees, palms on the floor, elbows bent, like they have just tremendous hamstring flexibility, full hip flexion range of motion. So that's something that's independent of muscular stiffness. So it's basically like it will take, if you have stiffer muscles, that describes how resistant they are to deformation, not how much extensibility in total they have. So essentially, if someone has stiffer muscles, it just takes more energetic input to make them extend if they're trying to resist extension. But if they're already kind of relaxed, they can still extend the way you'd want them to, and you'll be able to achieve the range of motion that you're going for. So resistance training does increase muscular stiffness. Like if you're trying to resist a muscle extending, getting stronger, doing resistance training will help with that. But if you're like intentionally trying to relax a muscle and access a long range of motion, muscular stiffness isn't really going to work against that.
That makes so much sense. And I'm no biomechanist, but I've learned a little bit about like stiffness, and I've taught about that before, like how it's just so easy to in our lay people understanding, we think stiff means either achy or tight, which I guess tight, as we know, is also kind of another air quotes word, because what does tight mean? But that in a biomechanical sense, stiffness isn't really about range of motion. It's more about, like you said, that ability to resist deformation. And deformation is like a length change. I'm just like, is that correct to say what because in case people don't know what that means, deformation.
Travis, do you want to take it from here?
It's funny because like I wrote a paper, or co-authored a paper in 2018. We were talking about the pec minor and some misconceptions that people had around a short muscle versus a tight muscle versus an adaptively shortened muscle. And we ran into issues with reviewers and with engineers who we were working with on the study about the difference between stiffness, extensibility, and elongation. And the relationship between those, and shortened, and tight. And frankly, I don't even remember what the conclusion was, because everybody, like the physical therapy definition versus the mechanical engineering definition for those terms are so different, let alone the jargon or not the jargon, the way that we use it in every day. So I don't know. So it is confusing, and it's not only confusing for It's confusing even for researchers within one field and across fields.
Yeah. So just in a general sense, you want your muscles to be highly extensible. Like if you want them to be able to get longer, to access a long range of motion, you want them to be able to do that. But also for most applications, you still want them to be tight. And so a good, I think the best way to illustrate this is with jumping. So like both jumping and running. So in general, if you want to jump really high or run really fast or run slowly but with higher biomechanical efficiency, you want your calves to be very tight. And the reason you want that is both with jumping and running, the actual length of your calf muscles ideally shouldn't change very much. Most of the plantar flexion that occurs is going to be from your Achilles tendon, like when your ankle goes into dorsiflexion, your calves aren't changing length much, but your Achilles tendon does. And then it kind of stores elastic energy. And as you try to jump or take the next stride, that elastic energy is released. And that's a very good way to do it. One, because your Achilles tendon is really big and really strong and can release a lot of power when it kind of uncoils that elastic energy. But two, it's just a very energy efficient way to do it because that's just a purely passive thing going on. It's change in length of a passive tissue. Whereas if your calf muscles did actually lengthen as you squatted down into a jump or as your foot landed for a stride, then it's going to take active chemical energy turnover for your calf to contract and shorten again for that jump or for that next stride. And so if a muscle is stiff, essentially like when that foot hits the ground initially, your calf muscle will do a better job of resisting elongation so that your Achilles tendon can do more of that passive work. And ultimately it's more energy efficient. You run faster, you jump higher. But you also don't want your calves to be just super, super tight. So you can have really flexible calves where if you were stretching your calves and you're trying to get it to relax and you're trying to access just a ton of dorsiflexion range of motion, you can have that if your muscle is extensible. But then tightness is just a completely different variable where it helps you just be more efficient in most athletic things you'd want to do. So you want your muscles to be both extensible but also tight. And resistance training does that for you. Whereas if you're just doing stretching, it will increase the extensibility of a muscle, but it either won't affect the tightness of a muscle, I keep saying tightness, I mean stiffness.
I was going to ask that, yeah.
Yeah. It either won't affect the stiffness of a muscle or it'll reduce the stiffness of a muscle. So, generally you want it to be both stiff and extensible. And you get that with resistance training, and most other ways you'd increase the extensibility of a muscle either decreases stiffness or has a neutral effect on stiffness.
Thank you so much for explaining that. It's like these two different concepts that really they're not binary and they're not opposites. We ideally want both.
And I probably just made that even more confusing by just saying tightness 7 times when I meant stiffness.
Oh my
but
gosh.
for the entire last thing I said, I meant stiffness every time I said tightness, and I'm very embarrassed now.
But I think it's just so easy to do because people just think stiff means tight. I think it's partly what it's
I mean, if I'm not talking about science, if I'm just having a conversation with anyone in my life who doesn't want me to just like throw study titles and authors at them, right, I'm going to use the two terms interchangeably.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Yeah, and so I think it's just good for us to realize context because it's easy to throw terms around.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But like when we really wanted to talk, I guess scientifically, just clarifying our definitions for what we mean when we use them so we all know we're talking about the same stuff.
Right. So if yogis are listening to this, I assume they are,
Yeah,
and
I think so.
you either come across someone online saying that resistance training increases muscle stiffness, or you come across a scientific paper saying resistance training increases muscle stiffness, and you see that and you get scared and you're like, oh no, if it's
Right.
increasing stiffness, that's going to make me less flexible, it's going to reduce my range of motion. It won't. That's not how stiffness works. It's a completely different concept.
Right, and it's something ideally that you want, especially for, like you said, like a lot of athletic endeavors and in general, right? We want our muscles to be stiff and also like our tendons and ligaments to be stiff. would you say? Or am I like
Um,
opening a can of worms there?
Yes. I mean, ligaments for sure. Tendons. Does the same concept of stiffness apply to tendons?
I think so.
I think so.
They're all
I'm not a tendon
they're
guy.
all the same thing.
Yeah,
The
I'm.
musculotendinous junction, it's all one thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I guess you want them to be. I guess you want them to be stiff as well. Whatever. That's
Yeah.
too far afield because we're primarily when we're talking about flexibility, which I think is what we're trying to get
Yeah.
back to.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you're talking more about muscle stiffness than tendon stiffness.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think that you've done an excellent job kind of just outlaying that that where it seems like research is pointing us today is that strength training does not reduce flexibility. It doesn't make you, quote, tight. And so we don't have to worry about that. Like if we're yogis and we've heard about, if we're starting to realize that maybe our yoga practice doesn't give us all the strength we might want, and if that's a goal, we don't need to be afraid of bringing something like an actual weightlifting practice into our life or something. We don't have to worry that will decrease range of motion. So maybe though we could talk about the SPENT study because you've kind of established that we seem to understand that strength training does not decrease range of motion. But then there's this other study that came out that you wrote about, which I read, and that's kind of why I wanted you to come talk about this. It seemed like that study kind of could be a little confusing maybe if you look at it on the surface.
So there are two SPENT studies. So there was one from 2021 and then one that was published in early 2022. And they were basically the exact same study, but one was with female powerlifters and one was with male powerlifters. And so
So they milked it and got 2 publications out of 1.
as they should, that's
gotta do what you gotta
the game
do.
everyone else plays. So you would be a fool to not also participate.
Truthfully, I'm guilty as charged, but there are word limits in journals.
Yeah,
so
some good old salami slicing can.
yeah. It's helpful to see that it was probably from one data collection, but at the same time, there are reasons why you might want to analyze the data separately for men and women. And then with the journals, there are word limits that would prohibit you from being able to publish all of that in one paper.
Correct. Yeah. So let's see. So I'll start with the SPENT study on female powerlifters.
Yeah.
Essentially, so both of these studies compared the range of motion of, most planes of motion, most joints in the body. Like it was a pretty comprehensive range of motion assessment, and both of them compared powerlifters versus untrained controls. And the original study on female powerlifters found that they had pretty comparable range of motion in most joints to untrained controls, or maybe slightly greater range of motion in some planes of motion for some joints, which is consistent with the idea that resistance training has a neutral to positive impact on range of motion. But then a couple months later, a very similar study on male powerlifters is published, and they find that in several joints and several planes of motion, the male powerlifters had less range of motion than untrained control subjects, or I think they were recreationally trained subjects.
Yeah.
Um,
but not competitive, right?
Right.
Wasn't that the difference?
Yeah, so people who lifted a little bit but weren't like super serious about it. And so that seems to conflict with the idea that doing a lot of resistance training would have a neutral to positive effect on range of motion if these male powerlifters do have reduced range of motion relative to recreationally trained subjects. But what I proposed in that article is that, when people think about flexibility, the first thing that comes to mind, for good reason, is just how extensible a tissue is, right? So if you're interested in, say, triceps flexibility, you might primarily think just how extensible are my triceps? How much can those muscles lengthen to allow me to flex my elbow? But there's another consideration in play, and that's just how big are your biceps? Because muscle tissue takes up volume, it takes up space, and it is not infinitely compressible. And so, if you've ever been in the same room as like an IFBB bodybuilder, like one of those people who's on a ton of steroids and is just outrageously jacked. They have muscles where you didn't think muscles even existed. Like they have reduced range of motion in just about every joint, because regardless of how extensible their muscles are, they're just so big. They have so much muscle. Like there is a finite amount that they can flex their knee because their hamstrings and calves are so big. You know what I mean?
Totally, they push into each other.
Yeah.
They meet.
And so I think that that's primarily what's going on with the study of male powerlifters. And one thing to back that up is in that study, they actually found that reduced range of motion was correlated with greater success in powerlifting. So the bigger, stronger people who are more successful powerlifters also had reduced range of motion, which you could interpret that to mean, oh yeah, doing more and more powerlifting reduces tissue extensibility. Or it could mean, and this is what I suspect, doing more and more powerlifting just builds more and more muscle. And at some point, regardless of tissue extensibility, that's going to reduce range of motion. Just because you just have so much muscle and it can only compress but so much. And so I think that I think the basic takeaway is that, like, no one gets too muscular by accident. Like that just doesn't happen.
For saying
Everybody's trying to do that and struggling.
Right.
Or that the people who do want to do it struggle to do it.
And so I think you probably don't have to worry about resistance training reducing your range of motion until you can look in the mirror and say, like, I'm pretty fucking jacked. Like it's not, you know, it's not going to happen after 3 months of resistance training or 3 years of resistance training. And it'll probably never happen for most people unless you either, you know, do some vitamin S or you picked really great parents for hypertrophy. Like I think most people just simply don't have the genetics to build that much muscle in the first place.
I think a lot of people think like, oh, I'm going to start strength training and I'm just going to put on slabs and slabs of muscle. And
that'd be nice.
And maybe at first the rate of growth, and I'm sure maybe you know this, is higher, and then you know it asymptotes out. But like bodybuilders who've been doing it for a long time, if they put on a couple pounds of muscle in a year, like from one show to the next 12 months later, like they're tickled.
Yeah,
they're excited about 2 pounds of muscle.
Like
right?
that's not very much.
And they're showing their before and after pictures. And they're like, look at how much progress you made. And for the person who's not a seasoned viewer of those types of things, they're like, well, they were jacked before and they were jacked after. I see that they were 168 natural bodybuilders. Like, I see they were 168 pounds before and 170 pounds after.
Yeah.
And to them, like, they made a ton of progress in 1 year.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
It's small.
Yeah. And so I think that's like... I think that's probably what's going on here, because especially like in this study where they're finding reduced shoulder range of motion in some planes, like that can absolutely happen. So they found that the male powerlifters had reduced shoulder extension range of motion.
And that's like arm back.
Which is arm back.
Just to clarify.
And like, dude, if your lats get big enough, your arms just don't go back that far.
Lats like get in the way.
Or like shoulder horizontal extension, so like arms out to the side, and you know, like you're gonna fly. You know, if your rhomboids and mid traps get really big, like the extent to which you can put your arms behind your body from straight out, that's going to depend to some extent on how much you can retract your scapulae.
Yeah.
You know, if your mid traps and your rhomboids, like they're between your scapulae, if they're huge, you just can't retract your scapulae as far. So like that's going to reduce range of motion there to some extent. And so, yeah, I think that's basically what's going on in those studies. And again, like that's something where if someone decides like, hey, I want to do resistance training, I'm worried about range of motion. For the first 5 years of your resistance training journey, that's not something that's ever going to have to come to mind. Like that is a realm that you might find yourself in if you do a decade of really dedicated hypertrophy training and you picked great parents for hypertrophy in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense. I think another thing you wrote about that study in your research brief was that the testing of the range of motion that was done in this specific study was not passive range of motion. It wasn't, but it was actually active range of motion. Do you remember that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So they were, and that's a good thing to bring up as well. They were all active range of motion tests, which further exacerbates what I'm describing right now. Because again, like if you're trying to do like active shoulder extension, you're using your lats to do that. Like that's your primary shoulder extender. And so, you know, that will cause the lats to tense up a little bit, which inherently makes them less compressible than they would otherwise be if you were doing a passive range of motion test. Same thing with like the mid traps and rhomboids. Like if you're like actively retracting your scapulae, you're doing that with your mid traps and rhomboids. Like you're tensing them, like they're contracting, which makes them less compressible.
They like get harder, kind of.
Yeah. Which I'll note is actually like kind of a cool thing. This might be a little bit too far afield, but in some research now, like, and I'm not exactly sure how this measurement works, but I think they use ultrasound to assess muscle hardness as like a measure of contraction intensity. So like most studies still use EMG, like they're measuring electrical impulses, but you can actually measure just muscle hardness as a metric for how hard a muscle is working.
No, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, so like when a muscle goes from being completely relaxed, not contracting at all, to contracting a little bit, it gets quite a bit harder. And then as you contract it harder and harder, the muscle itself gets harder and harder and less compressible. And like you can feel that for yourself right now. Like just squeeze your bicep with your arm completely relaxed, and then flex your bicep as hard as you possibly can, squeeze it again. You just can't squeeze it as much. Like it becomes less compressible. Yeah.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about shoulder extension, or I think in your research brief, you also talked about hip extension, which that's taking the leg, the thigh back behind you. And you were saying, if I do that actively, then it's like your glutes are contracting and becoming hard in order to pull the leg back. So so that just kind of works against being
That's
able
actually
to
one of like the manual muscle tests are a maximal voluntary isometric contraction position for the glutes.
Yeah.
So testing active range of motion of the glutes in a way that's supposed to elicit a maximum voluntary isometric contraction of the glutes is like, well, are we really testing the extensibility of the hip flexors in that position?
Yeah, not so much.
It's a measure of range of motion for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not like you pointed out in your research review. It's if they had tested passive range of motion, the results might have been different.
Yeah, for sure.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, so I guess again, just getting clear on terms is a good thing. Like when we talk about range of motion, that's just kind of a description of how far a joint can move. But if we're talking about tissue extensibility, that's more the muscle being stretched, how far can it lengthen?
Yeah.
Versus something like the muscles contracting on the other side of the joint versus your term that you used in the article, which was finite tissue compressibility. I think that was the term. There's like another factor that can, so range of motion could be this overarching like bucket term, but then it really could be a little more fine-tuned when we kind of break it down.
Yeah, and for most people, like unless you do just have a tremendous amount of muscle tissue, generally flexibility, range of motion is going to be limited by tissue extensibility first and foremost, and then just constraints due to, say, joint geometry secondly. So, if you say just have hips that aren't built for internal rotation, maybe your hip internal rotation is never going to be that good, and it's not because your external rotators are super tight, it's just because that's how your hips are built.
Totally.
So yeah, for most people in most contexts, those are going to be the two things limiting range of motion, and that will even be the case for 90% of lifters. But when you get big enough, then tissue compressibility comes into play.
And you also mentioned that the Spence had the two studies, and the earlier one was done on females, and the later one was done on males. But with females, there was actually not a difference in range of motion between, or I think I'm maybe like generalizing, but there wasn't much difference between the powerlifters and the untrained.
For most joints and most planes of motion, there wasn't much of a difference. And when there were differences, it was the female powerlifters being more flexible than the recreationally trained subjects. Yeah.
And sorry.
Like
That-
I hope this won't be too controversial to say, but
say it.
women tend to not build as much muscle as men. So
Right.
like not only is building too much muscle not a concern for the vast majority of male lifters, it's probably not a concern at all for virtually any female lifters. Like there are some women who do build a tremendous amount of muscle, but it's I mean, you can see that with gymnasts. Like female gymnasts are really fucking jacked. Like
They are.
they're tiny. They're very vertically small
petite.
people. But in terms of muscularity, I mean, a lot of gymnasts have muscularity that is on par with female powerlifters, and they also have just tremendous flexibility. So
Absolutely.
Good point.
yeah, I mean, if Simone Biles doesn't have to worry about flexibility, like she has tremendous flexibility. People listening to this probably don't need to worry about it either.
That's it. Yeah. And I would think for many yogis, a goal would be to have both, be both flexible and be strong through all of those ranges. So maybe that brings us back a little bit to the Afonso study, which you talked about before, and how that was the systematic review that really helped support the idea that strength training is an efficient means of increasing flexibility. But Greg, did that study, and maybe just general thinking in general on this topic, is it thought that strength training increases flexibility faster than, say, passive stretching, or maybe what might be called static stretching, or are they the same, or is it less?
So in that meta-analysis, it was head-to-head comparisons. So, 8 weeks of resistance training versus 8 weeks of stretching. So that, the speed component is already baked in. If you're seeing similar amounts of total range of motion gains, that necessarily implies that the rates of gains were, I guess it could have been a different time course over that 8-week period, but at least averaged over 8 weeks, it would be the same. I suspect that if there is a difference, it might be a little bit faster with stretching than resistance training. Because ultimately, with both of them, there's a shared mechanism by which range of motion can increase, and that's just simply the muscles getting longer. So in jargon, we would say an increase in sarcomeres in series. So your skeletal muscles, the smallest contractile unit of a skeletal muscle is called a sarcomere, and a single muscle might have what you would probably know this better than me, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of sarcomeres in series, one lined up after the other, from one tendon, from your origin tendon to your insertion tendon. And so things that put a stretch stimulus on a muscle can increase sarcomeres in series. So basically, if your biceps were previously, and this is just a random number I'm throwing out there, if they were previously 100,000 sarcomeres long, if you increase sarcomeres in series, they might become 120,000 sarcomeres long. And each sarcomere, and this is a hard physical constraint, each sarcomere can only extend but so far. Otherwise, it just tears, it ruptures. So by increasing sarcomeres in series, that does directly increase the total extent to which a muscle can extend. And so you can get that. And so that's probably the primary reason that resistance training can increase range of motion if you're training through a long range of motion. And resistance training probably increases I'm not aware of direct research on this, but I suspect resistance training through a full range of motion probably increases sarcomeres in series faster than stretching does, in part because resistance training is going to cause more muscle damage and will therefore be a stronger stimulus for muscle remodeling. And so if you're putting a stretch stimulus on a muscle where muscle damage is present, where more remodeling is going to happen, and it's going to happen a little bit faster just to recover from that stressor. You're probably going to see, I would assume, a faster increase in sarcomeres in series. But then the other important mechanism is just simply stretch tolerance.
Right.
So if someone has never done any stretching before, when they try to stretch a muscle, they probably don't actually reach the full end range of motion for that muscle. And so that's something that's going to be more kind of neurally mediated. And it's just a matter of like your nervous system getting comfortable with you stretching further and further, accessing more and more range of motion. And I kind of assume that adaptation would take place faster with stretching than resistance training, primarily because like you are like, if you say you're doing resistance training through a full range of motion, you're probably not. It's probably just through a long range of motion, not like a theoretically full range of motion. Like, I mean, so
depends on the exercise, right?
So like going back to forward fold, right?
Yeah.
If you were to do a comparable resistance training exercise, it might be a stiff leg deadlift or a Romanian deadlift.
Yeah.
And if you do that stiff leg or Romanian deadlift through what you perceive to be a full range of motion, like you're going all the way down until you feel a pretty deep stretch in your hamstrings before you come back up, like you're probably not getting quite as low and not doing like and not getting into quite as much hip flexion as you would if you were just doing a forward fold and just trying to pull your body lower and lower. Because I mean, there is some external resistance there. Like you can't fully relax into it as much as you otherwise would be able to.
Yeah.
So I suspect you probably, like of those two mechanisms, I think probably stretch tolerance would increase a little bit quicker with just pure stretching flexibility training. And you'd probably add sarcomeres in series a little bit quicker with resistance training. And in general, neural adaptations tend to take place faster and sooner than structural adaptations do. Like, you know, and you can see this with strength training. Like if you go to the gym the first time, maybe you try to bench press and you can barely bench press the bar. And then you work out for say 2 months and now you can bench press 75 pounds or something. That's what, close to like a 60% increase in strength, like the external resistance you can move. In that process, your pecs and triceps haven't gotten 60% bigger.
That would be kind of crazy.
Like your pecs and triceps may not get 60% bigger over the course of your entire training career. And so most of those strength adaptations you're seeing early on are more neural adaptations than structural adaptations. And I think the same thing is probably taking place with stretch training. So there will be structural adaptations, those that increase in sarcomeres in series, but most of the early adaptations will likely be neural adaptations. And I think that those neural adaptations will probably take place a little bit faster from just stretching and flexibility training than resistance training. So I think that maybe over the time course of 2 or 3 months, you would see similar gains in flexibility with resistance training and stretching. But I think maybe over the first 2 weeks, you would probably see larger gains from the flexibility training.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much for outlining that.
And I'll note, I could be totally wrong about that. Like
convincing argument.
I will fully admit I'm extrapolating from mechanisms here, but that's what my assumption would be.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that makes sense. I mean, you're extrapolating, but it's based on a lot of knowledge and about the physiology of how these processes work.
It's kind of the same way that your nerves can like habituate to most stimuli, like in particularly like noxious stimuli. So if you say, I don't know, like if you started working in a meat processing plant or something, and you're spending all day cutting up, frozen or very, very cold chicken or beef or whatever. Like if you've ever handled raw meat just in like preparing a meal or something, like a frozen stuff's fucking cold. It's
is
really cold,
uncomfortable.
and so I don't handle that many frozen things, and when I do, it takes like 3 minutes before I'm like, dude, my hands are uncomfortably cold right now. This is terrible. I'm miserable. I'm gonna stop what I'm doing. I'm gonna get some hot water running in the sink, and I'm just gonna try to warm my hands up before once more into the breach, But, if you do that for days, weeks, months, the stimulus is the same. Like the cold your hands are experiencing is the same. But like you start, like you either consciously or subconsciously, like your nervous system kind of stops perceiving that as quite as noxious of a stimulus, just because to some extent you habituate to it. And so it's similar with stretching. Like you're putting tension on muscles that nerve endings will sense, and if a large amount of tension on those tissues isn't something that those nerves are used to sensing and experiencing, the signals they're sending up to the brain is like, ooh, new thing is happening, I don't like it, it's bad, it's scary. But then you do it for a while, those nerves are exposed to the same theoretically noxious stimulus more and more. Nothing catastrophically bad happens, and I'm personifying nerve endings right now, but essentially they figure out like, oh, I can kind of relax. Nothing scary or bad is happening. I can let this tissue extend a little bit further.
That makes so much sense. Like that process of habituation, or just getting you feeling more comfortable there, realizing it's okay. Like if you're.
I don't know why the first place my brain went was a meat packing plant. I could have gone any other number of directions there, but whatever. That's what we recorded. That's what we're.
We know where your head's at.
Yeah.
That's really funny. It totally worked though. I mean, touching cold stuff. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, that discussion got me thinking about there are certain claims that we tend to hear, especially in the yoga world, but maybe in the overarching movement and fitness worlds. So I think it's really interesting that you suggested that you think actually passive stretching may be more efficient at increasing, like it's just faster means of increasing flexibility via the stretch tolerance mechanism compared to strength training. But I think there are a lot of claims out there that it's like the reverse, that strength training, or just what might be called like quote active stretching, where it's not necessarily strengthening, like maybe the loads aren't enough, but your muscles are still active as you're stretching. There are these ideas that those are more efficient means of increasing flexibility.
Well, I think that's an important point to bring forward, where I think it's tempting to dichotomize this, like strength training, stretching, two completely separate things. And so, it's interesting that they have some of the same effects. But I think that that's actually not correct. Like ultimately, like strength training is also strength training can also be stretching, and stretching can also be strength training. Right. And there's, there's kind of some fuzziness in between the two, where, strength training with like a stretching component would be like the RDLs or stiff leg deadlifts I mentioned earlier, where instead of just trying to load the bar up with the most weight possible that you can do for 8 reps or something, maybe you go with a slightly lighter weight, and you're really intentional about trying to go down on the eccentric each rep until you feel a really deep stretch in your hamstrings. Like, you're still doing an RDL. Like, I think if you're trying to put it in one of those two buckets, you'd say like, oh yeah, this is definitely resistance training. But you're definitely doing some stretching with it as well, Right. And the same thing could apply to, say, like chest flies. You can either grab the heaviest dumbbells that you can control through a decent range of motion and try to do 8 to 10 reps, or you can take 30, like you could grab like 30-40% lighter dumbbells, and every single rep you go down until you just feel a really, really deep stretch in your pecs and come back up. It's still resistance training, but you're definitely, like, there's definitely still a stretch stimulus there. And the same thing would apply to something like PNF style stretching.
We were going to ask you about PNF. Yeah.
Where, like it's partner assisted thing, or for some muscles you can kind of do it yourself.
Yeah.
You go like you get into a range of motion where you're already feeling a stretch on the target tissue, and then you do like a really, really intense isometric contraction, and then when you relax, you can access greater range of motion. And I think that that's kind of just speeding up that habituation of those nerves, like the stretch tolerance stuff, because like ultimately like they're sensing tension on the muscle, and so like as it's stretching, those nerves are feeling passive tension on the muscle. But then when you contract the muscle, you're adding active tension into it as well, without moving into a less challenging range of motion. And so that's kind of like hyper stimulating those nerves that are sensing that stretch. And so then when you relax, when you remove that active tension, then they're like, oh, well, I guess we can feel some more passive tension now, because that amount of active tension was ultimately fine, so but it's a really intense isometric contraction, like just as one would do isometrics in strength training. So that's a predominantly stretching based thing, still with like a pretty intense resistance training component to it as well. So they're not fully separated. Like you can use stretching to enhance resistance training. You can use like really, really intense muscle contractions to enhance stretching. Like the two coexist, and I don't think there is a really, really bright line between the two.
So whether you're standing and doing a Romanian deadlift into a really deep range of motion, and you could like imagine a snapshot of yourself there, you pause for a second in that lengthened contraction, or you're on your back and somebody's stretched you into a straight leg raise, and then you contract against them in that position.
Yeah.
Like you flip that a quarter way to gravity and the position's the same.
Right.
In one you were strength training, and the other you were stretching, but in both instances you're doing the same sort of muscular effort in a really lengthened position.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow, that makes it. Thank you for laying that out as well, because I think it is so easy for us to kind of dichotomize these concepts and a lot of things about the body in general. But thinking about stretching and strengthening as necessarily separate activities, and then these beliefs get layered on that they're binary, like the more strength you have, the less flexibility, and vice versa. But they can be overlapping at the same time. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this, but I've changed. I think I've been evolving in how I think about like active versus passive stretching. This is like some language that I've learned and picked up and used in the past, like that there are these like strong distinctions between when you're actively stretching versus passively. And what you were saying about that spectrum from kind of like stretching to strengthening and it not being so separate. I've been wondering about like those distinctions between the concepts of active and passive, and if it's really that important to categorize them as separate. Is it more just like a meaning like passive, meaning that you're completely relaxed, and an active stretch would be that you're really actively working those muscles? Like, is there always some maybe?
Yeah, no, I knew what you were asking. I was quickly trying to come up with an answer as you were asking the question. Yeah, I mean, I do think that, so I think just purely on like a fundamental level, you can't draw like a completely bright line between the two either, because like ultimately when you're stretching something, no matter how passively you try to stretch something, there's still going to be a fair bit of tension on the muscle, and there's also still going to be like some degree of contractile activity within the muscle,
unless you're like knocked out.
Unless you're knocked out, yeah.
Which is like there are certain special tests in orthopedics that like they can only do on you when you're on the operating table.
Yeah. So unless there's just no neural impulse or input going to the muscle, like even if you're not like say activating the motor cortex of your brain to intentionally contract a muscle, just by putting it in stretch, like that's going to activate like reflex arcs like at the spinal cord level that is going to cause some degree of muscle contraction. So yeah, I mean, like there's always going to be some degree of active component, and also like even with active stretching, at least to make it effective, there's going to be some amount of passivity as well. So, let's say you're doing like leg swings, like leg kicks to warm up to warm up everything around your hip, but then also like on the way back, you're trying to stretch your hip flexors, and on the way up, you're trying to stretch your hamstrings and hip extensors. That's not going to happen if when you're kicking your leg up, you're not also relaxing your hamstrings. Like if you're trying to contract your hamstrings super hard as you're kicking your leg up, your leg's not going to get that high. You're not going to feel that active stretch at the top. So like even active stretching is just alternating passive and active stuff. Like what you're like if you're moving into, say, shoulder flexion, you kind of have to relax your shoulder extensors and vice versa. So, there's like cyclical active and passive muscle actions going on there as well.
That totally makes sense. So they're not necessarily, like so separate. Like they seem really intertwined, or two sides of the same coin.
It's kind of interesting because I come not from the yoga world, but from more of like the S&C world, like strength and conditioning. And like, at least for most team sports, you wouldn't really say like, you really wouldn't say active stretching. Like most people would just call that a dynamic warm up.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that the way it's used in S&C is pretty smart for the most part, because like, you are trying to lengthen some tissues, but also like you're just getting your body moving. You're getting some blood flowing. You're increasing the temperature within the muscles that you're either about to stretch or about to train. And like that's also just going to help as well. So increasing the tissue or the temperature in a muscle is going to increase muscle extensibility to some extent.
Right.
Like it's going to make the soft tissues just a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more extensible. It's going to decrease the viscosity of your sarcoplasm ever so slightly. Just bringing the temperature up can help with really anything that comes afterwards. So like, when I think active stretching, like when you said that term, it took me half a second to remember what is active stretching. I was like, oh yeah, dynamic warm up.
That makes so much sense.
And so I do think that I do think that there's like sequencing implications there. Like I do think it's probably going to be more effective to do what would be traditionally thought of as active stretching followed by passive stretching instead of the other way around. But I mean,
why do you think that would be better?
Because passive stretching isn't going to be as much of a general warm-up. It's not going to increase the temperature in the muscles quite as much. So, do that first, kind of get the blood flowing, get everything moving. And then, in my case, I generally then be getting under the bar. In your case, you would generally be getting into, something that might be closer to a passive stretch. But either way, it's just going to help your body function a little bit better for whatever comes next.
Yeah, dynamic warm-up or dynamic stretching it's still like another form of stretching, but just like with movement involved. And then there's static stretching and there's active and there are all these like ways that we kind of categorize it. But maybe we could step back and just see it all as like movement through a full range with these like different qualities. But thanks for just making that, outlining that, making that a little clearer for us. And because you are a yoga teacher at the graduate level.
I have been previously.
But I don't think you're super in tune with like the yoga world, like some of the current trends that kind of abound in yoga.
No,
land.
Absolutely. I mean, every time you come over on the weekend and spill the tea on whatever the hot goss is in yoga these days, I always find it entertaining.
Yes,
because
I'm so glad.
That is not a community I'm plugged into.
Right.
And so I enjoy learning about the controversies in yoga, largely from you. but
right.
that's not something I would come across myself.
Yeah, you're like not tuned into those networks.
I'm a little bit tuned into both, so it's always fun to see like what each one's arguing about.
Yeah.
And I always love, just on the flip side, I love hearing about some of the fitness controversies that I might not feel like I'm tuning in a little bit, but not too. Like some of the stuff we've talked about, there's a lot there. But yeah, so Yogaland kind of has its fair share of like these controversies or arguments. And so one trend that I think Travis and I have just kind of seen, I kind of already said this in a previous question, but just these ideas, like, again, yoga's more complex than just being about a bunch of passive stretching. That's not all that it is, although that's kind of a stereotype about it. So you might think like for years, yoga's been kind of more on this passive stretching side, but more recently, these days, there's kind of this trend toward, again, if we're going to dichotomize and label, a trend toward placing more value on active stretching. And these ideas that sometimes that passive stretching is like inherently dangerous or injurious, and that active stretching is the only safe stretching, and that active stretching increases flexibility faster. So these are some, I feel like, would you agree, Travis, some of the claims that are kind of thrown around?
And in that case, when we're talking about active stretching, we're talking more about like that PNF.
Yes,
Type
the PNF
of
type
contracting one or the other or both sides of the tissue in an end range position.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so you just
what was the question?
No,
what was the question?
The question was, okay, so it's like relaying that there's this trend toward placing more value on active stretching. The reasons being, I'd say like two general reasons. One is that passive stretching is kind of fear-mongered about as dangerous. So I guess that's one point. And maybe to ask you if you would agree with that. And then the other point being that active stretching improves flexibility faster. Anyway, that's the claim. And so passive stretching is a waste of time. We should always be actively engaging our muscles when we're stretching. So it's kind of two things. I guess my question is like your opinion on both of those.
Man, so with any situation where you're interested in the risk of something, like risk of injury, it's the question is just like, it's not binary. It's not, is there risk associated with something or is there not? It's a question of how much risk.
Yeah.
Because like you could theoretically hurt yourself doing just about anything.
Cutting the cold meat.
Yeah, cutting the cold meat. I mean, there's really high rates of workplace injury in meatpacking plants. But yeah, no. So so I would not be surprised if people hurt themselves doing passive stretching from time to time. Do I think it's a particularly high injury risk? No, not really. One thing I will note is that, and I haven't seen research on this, but I would be surprised maybe if this wasn't the case to some extent. Oftentimes, like your risk of injury can increase just by doing kind of the same thing all the time, over and over and over.
Right.
Like you can just wind up with overuse type injuries.
There's a name for that, training monotony.
Yeah.
Oh, good term.
And so like I would not be surprised at all if some people who were doing a ton of passive stretching maybe started accumulating some injuries or just kind of just little aches and pains. They start doing active stretching and they're not seeing those same effects. But is that necessarily because passive stretching is better or safer? Or is it because it's just a novel stimulus? Like they're going away from doing the same thing they were doing for a long, long time.
Wow.
I strongly suspect that that's probably what it is. And then in terms of rates of adaptation,
right.
I don't have a strong opinion about that. I'm not immediately aware of research to point to, but I also don't follow the research in that area super closely. But what I will say, and this is to some extent kind of like an appeal to tradition, so I'm calling myself out on the front end. This is an informal logical fallacy. Do with it what you will.
Awesome.
What I'll say is that the people in athletic pursuits that require just tremendous, enormous range of motion, all of them do static stretching. 100%, including for sports where the mere practice of the sport could be construed as active stretching. So, like martial artists, for example, like going through some of the more advanced katas, like they demand active movement through really long ranges of motion.
Right.
Like for Taekwondo, like you can't do a lot of stuff unless you have really, really flexible
Can't kick
hips.
somebody in the head.
Yeah, and just by practicing those kicks, like how is that fundamentally different from active stretching?
Totally.
I can't think of a way that it's fundamentally different from active stretching. And yet, I promise you, all of those people are doing passive stretching. Like they all are. Like I don't know any gymnasts who either don't do or have never done a lot of passive stretching. I don't know any high-level martial artists who don't do or have never done a lot of passive stretching. I mean, even weightlifting. Like in weightlifting, there's a saying, the low man wins. Like for the clean and the snatch, you're trying to pull the bar as high as possible, but you're also trying to then get your body under the bar as far and as fast as possible. I also don't know any weightlifters who don't do a ton. And I mean, again, I don't know how like a clean wouldn't also just be active stretching. Like you're getting way the fuck down there. And so, yeah, I mean, for every sport where an enormous amount of flexibility is required, you're going to find all of the best people doing some passive stretching. So I like independent of the rates of adaptation, I think that if you want to get really, really, really flexible, there's probably going to need to be some static stretching in there somewhere.
And that might include for yogis, certain yoga poses that we could identify as really require. Like if you would like to embody the quote full shape, it really requires similarly deep amounts of flexibility. So that makes thank you for sharing that. And
I think too, like it doesn't obviously have to be one or the other, right? So if you did a study where you had people passive stretch, active stretch, or both, like the people who do both are probably going to get the best increases in flexibility. And it's hard to
I would assume,
It's hard to like, how are we saying, well, you're going to do, one group's going to do 30 minutes, the other group's going to do 30 minutes, and the other group's going to do 60 minutes? Or are you saying, well, 30, and then 15 and 15?
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like giving yourself more inputs would be beneficial to that end.
I mean, I would think so, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder
just out of curiosity, what is the proposed mechanism people are throwing out for passive stretching being injurious?
Thank you for asking that. I think
some guy said so.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
I think
go ahead, Jenny.
The idea of pulling on tissues being like that's gonna, I don't know, tear fibers or like cause injury in that sense. You know, like quote overstretching is a term thrown around. Like you're gonna pull too far, and that's gonna, I don't know, break some.
But also the idea that if you gain crazy amounts of gain flexibility through passive means, then you don't have strength in those ranges of motion.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that to some extent. My rejoinder to that would just be like, how much strength are you really building with active stretching? Like, and you know, I'm saying this as a power lifter, but if you're trying to build strength, like maybe just do some resistance training instead.
Instead of like some isometrics.
Yeah, like if that's the concern, it seems like it's going to get you from point A to point B a lot more efficiently.
Right. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm concerned about the ability, and also, so that sounds a fair bit like that sounds a fair bit like concerns around muscle strains just in athletics.
Yeah.
Like you know, like a lot of times when that happens, it's because a tissue that is unable to like absorb the forces being put through it. In this case, it would be just kind of the passive tension of going into a really deep stretch. In the case of sports, it's maybe like a hamstring strain when sprinting, like you're the hamstring is in a somewhat elongated position, but then you're trying to put a lot of force through it, like through the ground in your stride. But I think it's a similar type concept. And what seems to work really, really well for preventing strain injuries is just eccentric resistance training or resistance training with an eccentric component.
Like a longer eccentric.
Yeah. And so
like lengthening it out. Is that what you mean? Like a slower eccentric phase?
And so, even something like PNF style stretching with isometric contractions, I don't know that that's going to be as effective for preventing injury risk via that mechanism than just some sort of eccentrically biased resistance exercise would be.
That makes a lot of sense. Thinking about how that might happen. Yeah, so actually, that was on our list of questions to ask you, was about eccentric training in general. And sometimes I hear that if you're interested in flexibility gains via strength training, that focusing on the eccentric phase, which is that lengthening phase when the muscle is lengthening or when you're lowering the weight, that's sometimes claimed to be or thought to be like the better phase to focus on for increased range of motion.
So that is true. There have been a handful of studies just looking at range of motion following concentric only training. And concentric only training doesn't seem to do a thing for range of motion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because ultimately, like you're interested in increase in sarcomeres in series, and you're also interested in some soft tissue remodeling. And like I mentioned before, like any sort of muscle remodeling, generally having some muscle damage helps kind of speed that process along. And you just get a lot more muscle damage with eccentric training than concentric. Practically, I don't think it's worth worrying about all that much because like most resistance training you'd be doing does already have an eccentric component.
You kind of have to go out of your way with like a sled push, which most
like
people don't have
throws,
access to. Yeah.
Those would be like concentric only. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but most normal has both.
Yeah. So I would say you probably wouldn't want to go out of your way to do concentric only training probably if flexibility and range of motion and injury risk reduction are concerns of yours.
Although there are times and places completely outside of that context, like, we don't want to get as sore before a competition. So
I'm just saying, like, if those are the adaptations you're looking for.
Right.
But I'm not convinced that eccentric only training is necessarily better than just kind of normal resistance training that has both an eccentric and concentric component.
As well.
For flexibility, you mean specifically?
Yeah. Well, for flexibility, injury risk prevention, the whole works.
Right.
Sometimes it depends on the exercise, right? Like, because you can't do Nordics concentrically, or most people can't.
I mean, you can. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You can.
I don't know if I can anymore.
Wait, what?
I used to do a ton of Nordic curls, and at my best, I could do them like holding a 45-pound plate to my chest for like a set of 8.
Wait, do you mean
Wow.
lower all the way down and lift all the way back up? For our listeners who might not know, a Nordic hamstring curl is a very difficult, challenging hamstring. Like your ankles are, you're in a kneeling position, your ankles are hooked, someone holds them down or under something, and then you lower your whole body forward. This is what we're talking about, right? And I see them often done like you lower forward and then people drop. They drop down and then they spring back up. But you could also, I guess, lower with control all the way down and lift all the way up.
As a former world record holder, I shouldn't be surprised, but that's really impressive.
I'm kind of strong.
Holy crap!
But no,
You're world record.
Like most,
breaker.
like most, say, like soccer players who do a lot of because that's where they're super popular.
Right.
Soccer players strain their hamstrings a lot.
Left and right.
They found Nordics, and that seems to reduce risk of hamstring strain a lot. But yeah, like a lot of competitive soccer players can do full range.
Yeah,
of motion
they
Nordics.
also. They have different body proportions to competitive powerlifters.
So just to be clear, it sounds like you're suggesting that if flexibility is a goal within strength training, you don't think that we need to necessarily focus on eccentric only training.
Probably not, no.
Because normal strength training includes the concentric and eccentric. And
right, yeah.
Yeah, that was just one of my, because I feel like I hear that a lot. And I know that the eccentric phase is the lengthening phase. So I think sometimes we're just like, length means flexibility. So that's the phase. But I feel like you could, I mean, if you lower a weight down, then when you go to lift it back up, the concentric, you're starting from a lengthened position. So it's still in that position. Or if you do an isometric contraction in a lengthen, it's all just still muscles working in these lengthened positions.
Yeah. And just in general, like going back to the idea of just kind of overuse injuries, I think that that's like a pretty generalizable concept. Like the powerlifters I know who are the most injured and broken in their mid-30s are the ones who like only do powerlifting and don't do pretty much anything else.
They don't ball out like you.
Well,
on the hoops.
Well, they also
because Greg's a basketball player.
But like they don't still play sports. They don't do yoga. They don't even just shift to some other barbell pursuit for a while. Like they don't dabble in weightlifting. They don't dabble in bodybuilding.
Right. Even people who go back and forth between bodybuilding and powerlifting, they probably are less broken.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with runners. Like a lot of middle-aged runners aren't doing that well, but like middle-aged people who do cross training tend to be doing just fine. So someone who gets out and runs 100 miles a week versus someone who does a similar overall volume of aerobic training split between running, swimming, cycling. The people who do cross training in just about every pursuit tend to have lower injury risks and just tend to age more gracefully than people who don't. And so I mean, going back to the idea of, people who are just doing the same type of stuff a long time.
Same yoga practice
for
years and years.
And they start accumulating little injuries, little like joint discomforts here and there. And then they find, oh man, I feel a lot better if I do just some other type of stretching pursuit. Yeah, I definitely think, well, that's probably overstating it. I strongly suspect that what they're experiencing is just kind of the generalized benefits of cross training. Yes. And that if instead of doing active stretching, if they were like, hey, I'm going to go for a jog once a week, or I'm going to lift weights once a week, or whatever, it would probably have similar beneficial effects for them.
I love that observation too, because it doesn't then pick out any one activity as being like that the activity is the problem.
Yeah.
Like it's not necessarily that yoga is curious.
Or that the thing that you switch to is the answer.
Or that the thing that you switch to is the
sole answer.
Again, it's like that binary, like this is the problem, this is the answer, but it seems like it's about like this bigger picture. Mm-hmm. If yoga is all you do, or any activity is all you do, it's not that yoga is the enemy.
Well, and there's also just the concept in the injury literature of like injuries relative to exposure. So if you've done 5,000 hours of something and you've gotten injured doing it a few times, you can look back on it and say, damn, I got injured several times doing this. And then you do 10 hours of something else and you're like, man, this makes me feel good and I haven't got injured doing this. Just think back and it's like, well, did I get injured in the first 10 hours when I was doing this other thing? No, I didn't. It was only after I'd been doing it for 2,000 cumulative hours. So, it's like scaled to exposure. So, I mean, there are certainly some physical pursuits that are like almost inherently more injurious than others.
Right.
So like competitive strongman training, not good. I mean, it's good in a general sense. Strongman's awesome. But like the research tends to show that like per 1,000 hours of training, strongman competitors get hurt way more often than bodybuilders, weightlifters, powerlifters. Wow. So yeah, like even scaled to exposure, like kind of dangerous sport. But I suspect that if you looked at like injury risk in yoga, like injuries per 1,000 hours of participation is probably
they're pretty low,
hideously low. Mm-hmm. And so like, is that what hurt you, or was it just that you engaged in several thousand hours of really any physical pursuit? And I think that's probably what it is.
That makes so much sense. I think that that's an important message for people to hear and integrate. And I think it's bigger than just the yoga world, but I know in our kind of more narrow yoga world focus, I think our community could use to hear that message more. And that's really wonderful. Like there's a bigger picture to movement and pain and injury, and cross training is excellent. And like we're all such strength people, but I think we also all wouldn't say that strength is the only path or like the answer for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just, if you have these goals, then this is a great means to those goals.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, Greg, I feel like, so we had kind of a list of some things that we were hoping, some questions that you could answer, and I feel like you answered all of our questions and more. Were there any lingering like thoughts, Travis, that you can think of that we might, or questions we had, or do you think he like more than covered?
I think you outdid yourself.
I really do too.
Well,
What do you have to say?
I tried my hardest. And I'm happy to live with the results.
That's amazing. We feel so thankful that we got to like have your voice here to have this conversation, and that our audience could be like. So, I know how well known you are, especially in the fitness and the S&C worlds, but in the yoga world, I feel like maybe some very geeky people.
I assume no one knows about me. That's
You can fly under the radar at your
don't know why
local at your local yoga class.
Oh, like if Greg went to a yoga class locally, you don't think he'd be recognized?
I mean,
like you would think maybe he wouldn't be recognized.
I don't know how well known you guys think I am. I fly under the radar in most gyms.
I believe you have the 8th most popular podcast
on Apple
fitness
in
and health.
There you go.
But
it's just a rumor.
I will merely reiterate that I fly under the radar in most gyms. Like most lifters don't know who I am.
Only the ones who are really in the know.
I mean, yeah, only the cool ones. But.
Right. Yeah.
I think that speaks to like how we can get in our own, like not echo chamber's not the right word, but just our own segment that we tune into in any realm.
Mm-hmm.
But I know the fitness world is huge. Mm-hmm. So maybe we're thinking, I don't know, evidence-based fitness world, or I don't know if you think that's a good term for it, but or the science-based fitness world. Maybe when we get more narrow then. But you have the 8th biggest, most popular podcast in fitness.
Although people aren't seeing your face on the podcast necessarily.
I mean, it's even the case like within the resistance training world. I feel like once a week someone's just like, hey, I heard this thing from this person on TikTok about XYZ, about resistance training. And I'm like, I've never heard that thing. I've never heard of this person. And then they send me a link and it's someone with like 3 million subscribers.
Yeah, actually that happened.
I'm just like, okay.
That happened to me.
That happened to
me today, where I stumbled upon an Instagram account of a physical therapist with 800,000 followers. And I was like, I've been doing this rehab fitness Instagram thing for a while, and I never heard of this person before. So there's probably like
it's a wide world,
entire parallel universe, and maybe Jenni's husband Craig, who does social network analysis,
right, might have some insights
better,
on that.
be able to explain why that is,
totally. But in our world, Greg's work is like super well respected, and
you're famous in our books.
That makes me deeply uncomfortable.
We're hoping that our community and our audience of like yoga and movement science minded people will now like hopefully they'll be exposed to Greg and his work, and to consider, like I mentioned earlier, like I've learned a ton from. Well, your podcast alone, which that's just free education, but also your Mass Research Review, which I've been a subscriber to for a few years now. It's just for people who are really interested in learning about the science behind strength and all the current research.
Or his MacroFactor nutrition app, which I'm an avid user of and can say wonderful things about.
I will say, if you listen to this and you are interested in subscribing to Mass based on this alone, you're like, oh, those studies they talked about, that sounds really interesting. Don't do that. That's we just discussed 100% of the Mass content output about stretching and flexibility.
You're so funny. You're saying you don't cover stretching a lot?
Not that often. So if you're also very interested in strength training or like scientific sports nutrition, check it out. But if you're like, ooh, this was some cool Mass content about stretching, let's subscribe to see what other stretching content there is. There's not any. This was all of it, but we do talk about a lot of other cool stuff.
Absolutely. So I highly recommend, and we'll totally put links to all of your offerings in our show notes. But just for while listeners are on, is there any like one place you'd recommend, like your website maybe, like for people to go to find you?
Yeah, check out strongerbyscience.com.
Yeah, sign up for their email newsletter, and then you'll just kind of be in the know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for having this conversation. I learned a lot just in talking to you. I know our listeners will. Thank you for sharing so much knowledge.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was a blast.
Yeah.